Welcome to the Creative Cast. I'm your host, Tammy Munson, podcast producer, coach, and CEO of Wildfire Creative. Are you struggling to grow and monetize your podcast? Want to learn more about starting your own podcast? Are you looking for the secrets behind the business side of podcasting? Well, friends, you are in the right place. Here on the Creative Cast, I'm going to be sharing all the tips and tricks on all things podcasting for the faith-based podcaster. Each episode is going to contain powerful information to help you get started with your own podcast, learn the secrets of building a business, and of course, growing and monetizing your podcast. All right, y'all, without further ado, let's get started. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Creative Cast. I'm your host, Tammy Munson, and I am so excited that you guys are back this week, and we are in the thick of September. Actually, September's almost over. It's crazy. Today, I wanted to kind of talk about one of the common questions that I get about podcasts, and that is how to structure episodes. And this is for people who are they're getting ready to launch mode. And most people know from listening to other podcasts, there's the intro, the main content or interview, and the outro. Yeah. But y'all, there's so much more to that. And that's why I constantly preach the importance of outlining your show and create at least a basic script so that you know where you're going. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about the podcast intensive that's coming up. Okay, y'all, it's go time. This is the last and final week to take advantage of Wildfire Creative's new quick launch podcast intensive. Now, if you want to launch a podcast, but for whatever reason, time, motivation, know-how, you still have not made that a reality, this intensive was designed specifically for you. In just 6 weeks, this intensive is going to show you step by step how to turn your podcast idea into an actionable podcast plan. You also get to enjoy a built-in community of about 6 to 8 fellow new podcasters to lean on for help, support, and encouragement. Okay, so this is a little bit of what you get. You get 6 weeks of on-demand podcast training videos, custom workbooks with weekly prompts and action steps, 6 weekly live coaching calls with me and the rest of the intensive, a bonus library filled with resources, templates, worksheets, you name it, access to the private community page and discussion board, and lifetime access to all the materials. Yes, lifetime access. Now, at the end of the 6 weeks, I promise you that not only will you have everything you need to finally launch that podcast, but you'll make some amazing friends in the process. And y'all know how much I believe in the power of community. Something magical happens when people are in community together. Now, the doors close for the podcast intensive at midnight on October 2nd, and registration costs less than $50 a week. So what are you waiting for, friends? Head on over to wildfirecreativecompany.com/quick launch to save your spot today. Okay, so when I start working with new podcasters, a lot of them, as we get through the techie stuff of getting the right mic, why do you need headphones, and we start getting into the structure of the podcast itself, a lot of times I get questions like, well, how do I create that? What should or shouldn't be in it? Well, that's entirely up to you. Now, you may love something that another podcaster hates. Remember, this is your opportunity to be extremely creative and develop interesting ways to deliver your content to your audience. Now, the structure of podcast episodes is just as important as the content itself. The individual elements of your episodes must be in the right order to impact your listeners. Having a clear structure to your episodes can hook your listeners in and keep them engaged, make editing easier in post-production, and make interviews run as smoothly as they possibly can. Now, let's talk about your audience for a minute. It's important to remember who is listening to your podcast, especially in terms of length. So if you include a lot of long segments that aren't really relevant in the podcast, let's say the podcast is targeted toward moms of young children, chances are they don't have a lot of time or patience to listen all the way through. By understanding who your listeners are, you can create an experience for them that they'll return repeatedly. So here's a little pro tip. The shorter, the better, no matter the audience. Now, generally speaking, the sweet spot for most podcasts seem to fall somewhere between 25 to 35 minutes. On average, again, look at your audience and determine, can your content fill that much space? Does it need more time? Does it need less time? Because usually when I get asked this question about how long it should be, generally I say this: exactly as long as it needs to be. We don't want something that's going to be 45 minutes where you have to take 15 minutes of that and fill it with a bunch of fluff because you just can't fill that space. So create the content and make it be as long as it needs to be. Again, take your audience into consideration. Does it need to be shorter? You could always shrink that content down. You could always take things out. Now, the most successful podcasters or podcasts are typically the ones that stay consistent from episode to episode. I know I preach consistency all the time, but y'all, it really makes the difference from a successful podcast to a not very successful podcast. Because by being consistent, your audience knows what to expect from you. So if you like to experiment a lot with different things, change things up a little bit, throw a new thing in here and there, you want to make sure that you always include at least the intro, the main content, and an outro. Maybe you change up the ending segments. Maybe you change up the music from time to time. It's your podcast. You get to do what you want. But those three main things will help to ground your listener and let them know what to expect from each episode of your podcast. Now, how do you choose the podcast segments? So let's take a little bit deeper dive on these main segments, okay? You might choose to include different segments based on the format of your podcast. So let's look at your intro. You will have regular standard episode intro that you've already pre-recorded, so you don't have to record it each week. Your episode introduction can be a quick overview about what you're talking about in this episode, maybe a short bio on your guest, or even a sponsored ad or promotion for an upcoming product or service. You've heard exactly that today on this episode. Then we get into your main content. So the primary content of your episode, it could be a guest interview, a solo monologue like this, where you're teaching something or giving tips and tricks on something, or it could even be a narrative audio drama type episode. This content is typically the longest portion of your podcast. It's the meat of your podcast. It's what people really tune in for. What information are you sharing with them? And then, of course, there is your outro. Now, your outro is just as important. So don't skip this. In your outro, you should direct your listeners to a specific call to action, such as a rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, or follow me on Instagram. This segment is key to building your audience beyond your podcast. Now, I want you to begin to think about what other segments you could have for your show. What are you offering your audience right now that is relevant to the episode's content? When do your guests have the opportunity to share their offers with their listeners? I generally recommend to all my clients to listen to other podcasts to get an idea of the different segments. Things you like, even things you don't like, things that bother you. This podcast, usually it's just a quick wrap up, what's happening next week, and there may be a share this with a friend or something like that. Recently, we've started doing recommendations. I'm getting a lot of feedback saying, yes, I love it. Please continue with that. So, of course, that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, you can also, like I said, you could also include special segments like recommendation or fun questions with your guests. Questions that they don't normally get, like what's your favorite product? Or the best thing you got off of Amazon? Or are you tea or coffee? Are you team pumpkin spice? Change it up a little bit every now and then. Who knows? You could even add maybe a random rant to your podcast or things that you see in your particular niche that bother you or you would like to change. One of the structure models that I use for podcasts is the 3-act story module. In the main content of your episode, think of the structure starting with the hook or something that will capture your audience attention and really get them invested. So let's quickly kind of go over the basics of storytelling here. Because our podcasts, we're sharing our stories, we're using our voice, we're creating awareness. So we need to add some elements of storytelling. So first is the setup. Now, the purpose of the setup is to build interest and suspense and make your audience want to hear the rest of the episode. Most importantly, this is where you set the stakes. How will it affect the characters if a bad thing happens or a good thing happens? The setup. The first act must grab your listener's attention. It's a critical element in your podcast. So, for example, let's take a more technical topic of setting up a new business, okay? Pretty boring, pretty straightforward, pretty dry stuff, right? But information that we need to know. We can turn a potentially dry episode into a riveting story. So instead of diving in straight into a list of different strategies, different things that you need to do, legal things, setting up a bank account, all of those types of things, you can create a little more drama, so to speak, by setting the scene with a problem. So let's say we're talking about optimization strategies. You could explain why a poor conversion rate can drag your business down and introduce the listener to a situation where maybe you were affected by poor conversions on your website. You can use this first act to create the stakes and make people care. You want them to think, hey, I need to know more about this. I'm going to continue to listen. The second act is the delivery. Now, the delivery is the core part of your story where you're going to entertain, inspire your audience, even teach. Now, the most important part of the second act is the authenticity. Plot twists and problems should seem real. For instance, we all make mistakes, right? Nobody's perfect. So it's good to highlight a character's errors, bad habits, near failures, and actual failures. Because that's what we do in our everyday lives. Characters who conquer adversity without any kind of sweat equity aren't very interesting. Think about your favorite movies. Now, when I say characters, I'm talking about you, the host, or the character who is experiencing a problem that you're sharing about. So let's just say, for example, say Beth just finished her life coaching program, but she doesn't know how to set up her new business legally. Beth is the character. Now, this means that when you tell your stories about how you or maybe others overcame problems, don't be afraid to weave in external or internal failures because nobody is perfect. And failure, or as I like to call it, opportunity to learn and grow, is a natural part of life. If a lesson was expensive, explain the real cost. People need to know that. They need to know that not everything we're going to do is we're going to knock it out of the park. Sometimes we're going to fail, and we're going to fail big, and it's going to cost us, whether it's monetary or otherwise. Let's say you're interviewing a guest, and your guest has really grown as a result of a particular situation. You could create a contrast between the old version of themselves and the new version and what transpired in between to make that happen. Then there's the third act, or the resolution, or the application of knowledge or a lesson learned. And this is really where you can apply the content to your audience in a way that helps them or solves the problem. Now remember, you can apply all these elements of storytelling to podcasts of all formats, whether interview style, solo, co-host, narrative, audio drama, a hybrid of all of these. The purpose of the resolution, or the third act, is to give your audience a payoff. It's a satisfying end to reward them for following along the story. Because if you fail to resolve the story, at best, they're going to consider your podcast unmemorable. At worst, they'll feel like you wasted their time and probably won't return. In this final act, you need to reveal that final piece of information that solves the problem or bestows the knowledge, the lesson. Explain that main thing that you want your listeners to walk away from. If they don't learn anything else, this is the one thing. So this means you need to plan every episode with the end in mind. You, as the host, should always know exactly where you're going and where you're going to end up. And most importantly, you shouldn't reveal the climax or the answer or the resolution too early in the episode. Otherwise, you'll never build that tension. Now, in your episodes, you might follow this structure for your main content, creating interview questions that lead your guests on a path toward their own point of no return or moment of truth. Or in episodes like this, you may just use storytelling to emphasize a point. So how do you outline your episode? As with any journey, you need a plan, right? And this is where your script comes in. It makes sure that you're going to get there. It's your GPS. Now, I know there are a lot of podcasters that love to record by the seat of their pants, and I love them for it. But I don't recommend this, especially as a new podcaster. Now, but here's why I don't recommend it, because you can easily go off the rails, and then it doesn't make any sense. And then there's no resolution. So you need a script. So it could be anything from a list of bullet points to help you stay on track to even a more formal word for word script. Now, whether it's a full script or just an outline, it can help you decide how to break up different segments on the show, how long to spend on each one, and where to include segues or even sponsored ads. If you host an interview podcast, please make sure that you're doing your research before and then create notes that you can insert into your script. Write guest questions. It can help smooth out the transitions and really put your guest at ease. One other thing I recommend is if you are recording remote interviews via Zoom, or my preference and recommendation, Riverside.fm. Nope, not an ad, just love. This step is a good idea because when you share with your guests ahead of time some of the questions, it's going to ensure you're both on the same page for the interview itself. No one is caught off guard, and they can do their own prep for your interview. Now, closing with a call to action is the easiest and probably the most important of all of these things we're talking about today. You want to make sure that every episode has a specific call to action for your listeners. This essential piece will turn listeners into loyal fans. Now, I always recommend that your outro includes calls to action, but the main content of your episode should also include a call to action if it's available to you within your podcast format. Audio dramas, probably the exception here. Now, like I said, call to action applies to everybody, whether it's asking listeners to book a call, rate, review, subscribe. Maybe it's asking your listeners to sign up to become Patreon subscribers. Whatever it is. Regardless, you want your listeners to take the next step with you, even if it's just to sign up for an email list. Whatever the call to action is, that's up for you to decide. What's the most important thing? So let's say you're wrapping up an episode with a guest, and you've allowed them to plug their offers and upcoming work. Before the outro, you might include your related offer, like a freebie related to the topic you discussed. And by sharing a freebie with your listeners, you're providing added value when you ask them to take that next step. So as you're planning out your episodes, you're organizing the structure into setting the scene, creating that tension, then finding that resolution. Podcasts typically benefit from a little bit of structure. That's for all of my fly by the seat of your pants kind of girls and guys, and a few parameters to help you stay within the rails and really help your creativity thrive. So, with just a little bit of planning, y'all, you can make every episode an engaging, shareable, audience growing piece of content. Okay, y'all, I am so excited about next week's episode. Seriously, so excited because I am sharing with you an interview I did with my good friend, Kate Bradley Chernus, former rock and roll DJ, former XM radio host, and currently CEO of Lately. Now, Lately is an app that will help you write better marketing content in collaboration with artificial intelligence and software automation. It's amazing. So in this interview, we talk about Gary Vee, some of her stories from her time at XM, and how Lately can help you as a podcaster. You don't want to miss this one, y'all. Okay, I don't really have a recommendation this week, but I do have, it's a little news segment. Amplify Media and podnews.net analyzed 1 million podcasts. That's a lot of podcasts that are listed in the podcast index over on Apple Podcasts. And they found that only 13% of all podcasts had produced an episode in the last 90 days, and only 4% of those had produced 10 episodes and a new one in the last week. Okay, so they took that criteria and they applied it to see what categories contain the most prolific podcasters. So the criteria, 10 or more episodes, one released in the last week. They ran all the data and they found that religion and spirituality topped the list. How cool is that? And it's the category with the largest episode count. Now, the thing I found most interesting is while religion and spirituality came in at around 25,000 podcasts, not episodes, podcasts, Christianity only had 27 active, according to that criteria that they met, that are regularly and consistently, there's my word again, that are regularly and consistently producing content. If you're thinking of launching your faith-based podcast, y'all, now is the time. It's time to launch that podcast. So ladies, I say this all the time, but I truly believe it 1,000%. I believe in each and every one of you. I don't want that imposter syndrome, overwhelm, or intimidating tech stopping you from accomplishing your goals, whatever they may be. So let's walk through this journey together so you can spend less time worrying about the details and more time spreading your message, sharing your story, and your creativity. I hope that you have a great day. I hope that this episode was helpful for you. Let me know, and I will talk to you next Monday. Bye, y'all.